Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, as always, for joining. So I think there's different ways we can structure this, but for now, I was looking at this phrase. We were looking in the last year at this phrase of the Gemara, Kol midi de ispei gemar melachot chayv mishum Makkeh BePatish, which, if all it meant to say was that Makkeh BePatish equals gemar melachot, it should have said that. It should have said gemar melachot haynu Makkeh BePatish. It doesn't. It says anything which has in it a gemar melachot is Makkeh BePatish. So Rashi understood that Makkeh BePatish is smiting a hammer, or perhaps breaking a rock off a mountain, and everything else, any other gemar melachot is a tolda, and that's what the Gemara means to say. Anything which has a gemar melachot is a tolda of Makkeh BePatish. The Rambam understood that Makkeh BePatish is not the gemar melachot, but is any ma'aser uman, sort of a actualization of a specialized task. But the Rambam also understood that any gemar melachot is a tolda, and therefore he reads the phrase in the same way. What we were focusing on was a Meiri and an Aruch HaShulchan, who say subtly different things, but in terms of the reading of the Gemara, come to a sort of similar diuk and conclusion. The Meiri says that the essence of Makkeh BePatish is when an object is already complete. You have in front of you a functioning object, but it needs something else done to it to remove impediments or to finish it off. That's what Makkeh BePatish is. By the way, this isn't the Meiri himself speaking. This is the Meiri quoting the Chachmei Hadoros. I mention that simply because it's important always to realize the Meiri is a sort of encyclopedic work that quotes others. Because if you don't notice that, you will find contradictions in the Meiri. Because in one place he'll explain like one, and another place he'll explain like another. The Meiri is not saying his own viewpoint. He's simply, or sometimes he says his own viewpoint, but a lot of the time he's summarizing other opinions. So the Meiri quoting the Chachmei Hadoros says that Makkeh BePatish is not manufacture of an object. Makkeh BePatish is an object that you have in front of you, completing it and removing impediments or the like. So, for example, he learns that the rock is chotzuv, that the stone is already huge from the mountain. It's detached from the mountain, but now it needs to be separated. That's Makkeh BePatish. But if it's still attached to the mountain, that by definition can't be Makkeh BePatish. Similarly, if you weave a garment, that's not Makkeh BePatish, that's manufacturing, that's making the garment. Makkeh BePatish is once the garment is woven, removing the hanging threads from it, as we saw earlier on Ein Hey Amud base. So Makkeh BePatish is not manufacturing something, but once it's made, once you have something in front of you, the chashivas of perfecting it. Now, it's a little difficult to understand exactly what the Meiri means. It seems somewhat paradoxical in some ways, because surely if finishing something off is the melacha, then making it from start to finish, manufacturing it, should definitely be the melacha. Nonetheless, that's not what the Meiri says. The Meiri says the weakness with manufacture is that you don't have a complete object in front of you. You're not working on a complete object in front of you. Makkeh BePatish is when you already have everything that's done in the body of the object, and I'm just doing things which are extraneous somehow to the complete object. That's the definition of Makkeh BePatish. The Aruch HaShulchan says a different svara, though it has some similarities. He says a melacha, a Makkeh BePatish is only where there is a unique and specific finishing off act. If something is finished off, but just doing more and more and more of the same, so eventually enough is done and you now have the finished object, that's not Makkeh BePatish. So what completes weaving, till enough is woven and now you have a complete cloth? What completes writing, till enough is written and you have a complete book? That's not Makkeh BePatish, because the final act is simply just another act of the same, another act of writing, another act of weaving, till it's completed. Makkeh BePatish is when there's a specific finishing off act. You've done the manufacturing act, you now do an act which is defined as a gemar melacha type act. That is Makkeh BePatish. So these are somewhat similar stories, but subtly and importantly different. The Aruch HaShulchan's model I understand much better, because Aruch HaShulchan explains to us that there's a unique act which has the quality of being a finishing off type act. It's the uniqueness of the nature of the act which makes it Makkeh BePatish. The Meiri says it's the uniqueness of it being that you already have a complete object that makes it Makkeh BePatish. So there's a subtle difference, but they are similar in how they end up reading the Gemara. Kol midi de isbe gemar melocha chayim mishum Makkeh BePatish means to exclude manufacture. Something which doesn't have a gemar melocha in it, but simply manufacture of the object. That's not Makkeh BePatish. That's that's just manufacturing. Makkeh BePatish is something which is specifically the gemar melochaness of it. That it's a separate and discrete act of being a gemar melocha, as Aruch HaShulchan says, or it's an act in an already completed object, where it's just extraneous things to the object that needs to be finished off. That's what makes it Makkeh BePatish. That was the view of the Meiri and the Aruch HaShulchan, which we discussed last time.
Why does that make it? What's the mishum then? Why are we having presumably mishum? We've always understood means a tolda. Why are they saying mishum there and not, as you said, just hainu? I don't understand.
So first of all, I don't know if everyone agrees that mishum means a tolda, and I don't know if they would disagree with the Rambam and Rashi that agree that all the other examples of Makkeh BePatish might only be toldas. I think their main point is that kol midi de isbe gemar melocha. If you just said Makkeh BePatish is gemar melocha, then you would think it meant where you're just doing and doing and doing until you finish it off. You wouldn't realize that the point is that it has a specific gemar melocha placed to it. This is how they understand the emphasis on this phrase, kol midi de isbe gemar melocha. Anything which has in it a unique and discrete gemar melocha type activity is Makkeh BePatish, as opposed to something which is just a continuation of the manufacturing process, and it's finished because it's the end, but not because it's a defined act of gemar melocha. I have to confess, I find the svara of the Meiri difficult to say. I don't really understand the svara of the Meiri. The Aruch HaShulchan I hear very nicely. We've had 38 melachas, and now there's a 39th melacha, which is an act, which is a discrete act of finishing off, of completion, different to the manufacturing process. That's why I hear a little, that formulation, I hear a little easier.
The Aruch HaShulchan mentions this problem he has with the Rambam about saying that within Makkeh BePatish, even if you haven't sort of completed all of the Makkeh BePatish, the Rambam makes you chayev.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether that fits in with the mishum Makkeh BePatish. In other words, you say once you're involved in the Makkeh BePatish process, then you're going to be chayev.
I hear the suggestion. The truth is, I don't understand what the Aruch HaShulchan is saying in the Rambam. The Aruch HaShulchan seems to be arguing that the Rambam agrees with this. He doesn't mention the Meiri, obviously. I assume didn't have access to Meiri in any way. He's saying something subtly different to the Meiri. But he seems to argue that this is what the Rambam means also. I personally don't understand how the Rambam fits in with this. To me, it looks like the Rambam doesn't mention any of these points. But the Aruch HaShulchan is arguing that the Rambam also goes with this hasbah. I don't see how he brings the Rambam into it. Anyway, that was the best attempt I had. I want to do two more things to finish off this discussion. The first is just give a final explanation of this phrase, kol midi de isbe mishum gemar melocha, and then argue that Rashi at least disagrees very strongly with this Meiri and Aruch HaShulchan thesis, and Rashi would hold that any completion of a manufacturing process is gemar melocha. Rashi has a simple model without any of these complications. Gemar melocha is just finishing off an object. If you finish off the object by just doing and doing and doing till it's finished off, that's enough. It doesn't go with this svara that there needs to be a specific and defined act of completion. So let me, just for the sake of our completion, we've mentioned basically so far 4 explanations of this unusual turn of phrase in the Gemara. Kol midi de isbe mishum gemar melocha. Number 1, Rashi. Number 2, the Rambam, who both say it comes to indicate that gemar melocha is only a tolda, not an av. And then we've mentioned that according to the Meiri and the Aruch HaShulchan, it could be this phrase is good for saying their view. There has to be a specific gemar melocha. There is a final reading in this, which is a suggestion by some poskim, which I'm not going to go into now because it takes us well beyond the scope of our discussion, in which they suggest that Makkeh BePatish is only when something is a gemar melocha, only when something is the completion of a melacha, not when it's the completion of something else. So if I'm engaged in doing something which isn't a melacha and I finish it off, that wouldn't be Makkeh BePatish. It's only Makkeh BePatish when it's completion of one of the other melachos, where what I'm doing is a significant enough achievement to be defined as a melacha in one of the other 38 or 37 melachos that exist. I'm not going to explore this in depth till we come to the second part of what I want to discuss today, which is the relationship between Makkeh BePatish and other melachos. But just for the sake of completion, some read this phrase of the Gemara with a different tune to the one we read it. Kol midi d'isbei mishum, kol midi d'isbei gemar melacha, chayiv mishum Makkeh BePatish. Anything which is finishing off a melacha is chayiv Makkeh BePatish. If it's not finishing off a melacha, even though it's finishing off something else, then it isn't Makkeh BePatish. That's the tune with which they read this phrase. That's where they put the emphasis and the stress in the Tana phrase. So I just mentioned that for the sake of completion, since we're working through all the ways of reading this this difficult phrase in the Gemara, but we're not going to go into that in depth for now. Okay, I want to now simply point out that we've seen enough of Rashi to know that Rashi doesn't go with any of these complications. Rashi does not accept this viewpoint that if you're merely finishing off, repeating, doing the same halacha, that isn't Makkeh BePatish. And I just want to remind you about several Rashis that we've seen in which this is clear. And the first Rashi we've seen is on the Gemara earlier, someone who blows into a glassware, chayiv mishum Makkeh BePatish, is chayiv for Makkeh BePatish. And Rashi says, when you melt the glass, nasa al yadei nefuach, it's made through blowing. So Rashi very clearly translates the Gemara of glass blowing as the whole process of glass blowing. You melt glass, and then you blow into it, and that's how you make the glass vessel. And there, on that, the Gemara says, according to Rashi's translation of the Gemara, Yochayiv mishum Makkeh BePatish. Now, the run on the Mishnah very clearly emphasized, and I think we also saw Rabbi Hananel, who very, I'm not 100% sure about Rabbi Hananel from what I remember, but certainly the run, the Shiur run, the Meyuchas run, said very clearly on the Mishnah that a different pshat, that this is talking about the completing blow of glass. So you've already blown into the melted glass and created a bubble, and the final blow of the glass, when you finish off the glass vessel, that is the Makkeh BePatish of it. Now, the reason we discussed this previously was to resolve the issue of Ein Binyan B'Kedim or Yesh Binyan B'Kedim, because we had a question on the Gemara: why are you chayiv mishum Makkeh BePatish when you glass blow? Why aren't you also chayiv for boina, for constructing a utensil? And we gave several answers to this question. One possible answer is you are chayiv mishum boina, and the Gemara is just saying also chayiv for Makkeh BePatish. We'll get back to that answer later because it's interesting in terms of being chayiv twice for completing something. Is it possible that every time you finish something off, you're also chayiv for Makkeh BePatish and for its core melacha? Another possible answer is that binyan b'kedim is when you're combining pieces together. Whereas glass blowing makes a keli without. Normally, when you build utensils, it's you slot bits of wood together, or you hammer wood together, or you assemble a clay utensil through assembling pieces. Thank you, assembly. Binyan b'kedim is assembly of pieces. Glass blowing is interesting because you don't assemble any pieces; you just blow into the glass, and therefore maybe that's the reason why it's not binyan b'kedim. A third answer to the question, though, is this Shiur, which is true. When you blow and you make the utensil into a rough glass utensil, that's boina. But now you already have a utensil. You already got the air pockets in the glass. You already got the utensil. The final act of blowing is just finishing off. That's Makkeh BePatish. And therefore, it's a classic relationship between constructing the keli, which is boina, and finishing off, which is Makkeh BePatish. Finally, earlier in the sugya, we pointed out that Rashi doesn't have to say this because Rashi holds Ein Binyan B'Kedim. Rashi doesn't think there's a concept of Binyan B'Kedim. That was Rashi on Ein Daled on the base. With the Chavis, you remember where the Gemara was listing when you manufacture a picture or when you make an oven, there's 11 melachos, or 9 melachos, or 7 melachos, whatever the numbers is. Rashi there asks, why isn't it also Makkeh BePatish? Why isn't it also binyan? And he says, Ein Binyan B'Kedim. So Rashi holds Ein Binyan B'Kedim. Tosfos challenged it. Tosfos left as difficult. So how do you explain Zechuchis? Tosfos there asked that question. He says, Tosfos is of the belief, unlike Rashi, that Yesh Binyan B'Kedim. Tosfos said, I don't understand Zechuchis. So Tosfos views it as a difficulty, but we gave several answers to it, including maybe also chayiv for boina there. Tosfos wasn't willing to say that, or maybe it's not assembling and therefore it's not boina, or maybe as the Shiur said, because it's not the actual blowing of the glassware, it's the final blow. Why am I doing chazara all of this? Because al kol ponim, whatever the hezbollah of all this background information is, the fact is that Rashi says that it's Makkeh BePatish for blowing the melted glass from nothing into something, into the glassware. So Rashi here, I think, argues with the Meiri and with Aruch HaShulchan, and he says it's very simple. When you blow and when you make something, that's already enough to be Makkeh BePatish. Yeah. So definitely not when you melt alone. The melting is nothing. There's no utensil there at all. Rashi doesn't say the melting is the melachot. He says Chavruta. Let's get the language of Rashi right. Chavruta. When it is melted, it's made through blowing. So the simplest understanding of Rashi is that it's that making through blowing, which is Makkeh BePatish. Yeah, correct. Correct.
So why is that so unique? Oh, we see from that Rashi saying it's the whole process.
Because the Meiri and the Pnei Yeshua both say that when it's tchilosa v'sofa ba'im ka'achas, that's not Makkeh BePatish.
Start with melted glass, which is cut up. Blowing is a separate.
No, the melted glass is nothing. It's no kedi at all. It's not. There's no utensil there at all. The Shiur says there's already utensil, already blown. You're now finishing it off. Whereas here, a melted glass, as nice as melted glass is, it's nothing. It's got no functionality to it. The glass object is the creation of the functionality. And I want to actually be fair to your question because it's an important point. Maybe I'm making an assumption here, which I should have spelled out, and maybe even you can critique my assumption. I'm assuming that when we talk about making something, we mean something of functionality, and the functionality is it being a utensil, and therefore the tchil of the soif is the functionality of the air pocket. Having heard your question, I hear that one could argue and say, well, maybe look at the whole place. It doesn't seem to me that's reasonable, but I hear that maybe I should have thought more carefully about that, and that needs to be weighed up. So I'm assuming that that the making of the utensil is making the functionality of a container, a receptacle, which is the glassware you're making, and that starts and finishes according to Rashi with the blowing, whereas the melted glass is nothing of any significance. Okay, so this is one Rashi which I think is clear about this.
Sorry. I just can't get over that chiddush because what you're saying in Rashi is that it doesn't have to be of the Gemara Malacha of the whole thing. When you start blowing a piece of glass, then that first blow, when you make the first air pocket, is Makkeh BePatish, even though you're nowhere finished.
I evaded that question. I don't know the exact answer. I assume Rashi would mean when I don't know if Rashi means that this is a one blow glass vessel or several, and when you finish the several, then it's Makkeh BePatish. But I think the point in Rashi, the point I'm bringing out in Rashi, is that he doesn't stress or doesn't emphasize or doesn't mention, and on the contrary says the opposite, that it has to be only when it's already somewhat blown and you're doing the last blow. He says that when it's melted and you blow into it, that's Makkeh BePatish. So Rashi is okay with the concept of one blow completing the vessel. If it's a several blow vessel, then I assume Rashi would agree. It's only the final one, which is Makkeh BePatish. I was evading the issue of what we define as an end. All I'm interested in is that Rashi doesn't say that manufacture can't be Makkeh BePatish. The reason I'm evading the issue, by the way, is because I'm unclear on it. Whenever I evade things, it's because I'm unclear on this. I don't actually know exactly how to define the end. Let me give you an example. The Gemara earlier in Halacha base, in the same sugya of glass blowing, says Haiman de Shokala Kufi Miglima. Someone who removes the threads off a garment is Chayv Mishum Makkeh BePatish. Now, if you finish weaving a garment, but you haven't yet de-threaded these hanging threads, whatever exactly they are, we discussed that when we learned the sugya, are you Chayv Mishum Makkeh BePatish for that too? Is that also Makkeh BePatish? Or is it possible there's several Makkeh BePatishes in the process of manufacture? Because you do have a workable garment once you're finished weaving it and sewing it all together, even if you haven't, or workable cloth, even when it's just woven, even if you haven't detached the threads. So is it possible to have multiple Makkeh BePatishes one after the other? I'm not entirely sure as to the answer to the question. It would certainly be easier, ADO, to adopt your assumption that there's only one Makkeh BePatish right at the end. I don't quite have that certainty, so I was evading the issue. Okay, so this is I think one raya in Rashi. The second raya in Rashi is the very topic of the Meiri. And this Henry, I think, was trying to bring out in the name of Henry. You were quoting a Chavruta, maybe that was Edgar, or sorry, Edgar, yeah. And I sort of pushed you off last year because we weren't yet up to that. But the second raya that Rashi argues in the Meiri is Rashi's very explanation at the beginning of Kuf Beis, at the beginning of Perek Kabona. The Meiri, not the Meiri himself, but the Meiri in the name of the Chachmei HaToros, says that this can't be that the rock is still connected to the mountain, and I'm doing the last act of hewing, because that wouldn't be Makkeh BePatish, that would be manufacturing. it must be that the rock is now disconnected from the mountain, cuts fully off the mountain, but still pressed against it. And I now push it off the mountain, push it away from the mountain, from the quarry. That's the act of Makkeh BePatish, which fits beautifully the Me'uri's, in the name of the Chachmei HaTorah's thesis of what Makkeh BePatish is. It's fully detached, so the object is fully manufactured, but it isn't yet, it's fully disconnected, but it isn't yet fully detached, not yet separated off. And the act of separation is Makkeh BePatish. But again, Rashi in Kuf Beis Samud Beis avoids all these complications, and he just goes simply, and he says that etc. And so on. So Rashi doesn't go into any of the complications of the Me'iri about elaborating that this is already detached in order to avoid the manufacturing issue. So again, I think this is Rashi Lishitaso, Rashi consistent with his view that the final act of manufacturing is Makkeh BePatish, and he doesn't need to say like the Me'iri that the object is completed, and only then after anything I do afterwards is Makkeh BePatish. So this is the second example of Rashi. I have to tell you, I have many other examples of Rashi, but I'm only trying to mention examples that we've met in our own learning, just for the sake of simplicity, in order to avoid bringing in other sugars. The Me'iri emphasized that that it has to be that it's fully broken off the mountain, and all I'm doing is now separating it so that it falls. Rashi doesn't mention that complexity at all. Rashi seems to say it's still attached. There's still a bit of rock joining my block to the rest of the rock face, and I'm detaching that. That's the melacha. The Me'iri said that can't be Makkeh BePatish, because in that case that's simply manufacture. I don't yet have that's just another act of cutting it away, chipping it off the mountain. It has to be it's fully detached from the mountain, and the Makkeh BePatish is now pushing it off, pushing it away from the mountain. Rashi doesn't say that that nuance at all.
And there's other things that Rashi was told that there's another melacha which has been done at the same time, which is the core melacha. We'll get into that soon.
I don't know if there's. By the way, I still don't know the answer to this question. What melacha is there in hewing rocks off mountains other than the final blow, which was Makkeh BePatish? I don't know. It's not bono because you're not assembling pieces and making construction. Is it korea, tearing? Is it mechateich? You'd have to work through and work out exactly what melacha is Makkeh BePatish. Is hewing rocks of mountains. I'm not entirely clear in my own mind of the answer to that question, because it's not a growing thing. It's not kotza. We saw harvesting salt from the mountain.
He does say that it has to be hewed away, otherwise it could be.
No, but that's where you want the precision or the smoothness of the cut. I don't know much about hewing, but I assume when you hew, the cuts are you're using a hammer. The breaking off from the mountain is fairly rough and ready, and then later you you sort of smooth it down and create a proper cut. I'm not sure if my confusion is halachic or metzias. I just don't know enough about quarrying. But my picture of it is mechateich. When we learn mechateich and memareach, we mechateich and memachik. I'm sorry. We understood that's where there's a degree of precision in the cut and where you're trying to have it exactly neatly squared off. Whereas I assume the process of hammering with a rock does not create that effect. From a little bit of Wikipedia and Googling that I did, it seems the way it works when you hammer a rock is because they understand the structure of rocks, and there's natural weaknesses in the rock, and therefore if you bash a rock with a hammer, it fragments off in a certain sort of structure or shape because of the format of the rock, and it doesn't just break into pieces because the rock's stronger at certain points, other one where their weakness is. But at least in my picture, that's not. I don't think that would be mechateich or mamachik because it doesn't seem to be smooth. And therefore, again, Tosus and I don't think it's relevant to that. So.
But then you've got two cases where Rashi's ways of understanding Rashi, where there is no other melacha which is going on.
Correct.
So that might make it into a type of Makkeh BePatish on itself.
Correct. And I was going to come on to that. I mentioned, for those online who didn't hear that excellent, I think that's an excellent comment. I mentioned online a suggestion of, in the reading of the Gemara, that only something which is anyway a malacha in the manufacture, then the finishing off would be Makkeh BePatish. I think in Rashi, at least with the glass blowing, and perhaps even with the hewing of the rock, there are no other malachas in the manufacture, and nonetheless it's Makkeh BePatish, and maybe not nonetheless it's Makkeh BePatish, maybe that's the essence of Makkeh BePatish, that there is no other malacha. And we will see, not today, but in Hashem, when we resume in January, we're going to have to look with great care at the relationship between Makkeh BePatish and other malachas, which is linked to what we're talking about over here, but not identical. Meaning to say, what would be the answer to the question of why isn't every time I do a malacha, why isn't it also Makkeh BePatish? So when I bake a bread, why isn't it also Makkeh BePatish? So the Meiri and the Aruch HaShulchan would give the answer because manufacturing isn't Gemar Malacha. In Rashi, who says that some completion of manufacture, the last bit of manufacturing, is Makkeh BePatish, and perhaps in the Rambam also, we would have to answer this question of why isn't every malacha also Makkeh BePatish? Why isn't Makkeh BePatish every malacha? And we'll give several answers to that question, including maybe Enochanami, it is, or maybe because Makkeh BePatish is where there isn't another malacha, and that's the whole point of Makkeh BePatish, and that's what we'll look at in the next year. But for now, you're making a really important point, which is certainly with glass blowing, according to Rashi, the Ein Binyan B'Kedim, and perhaps with Chatzivas Even, if we are correct. The malacha is the Makkeh BePatish is deliberately there, or also there because there is no other malacha. That is entirely correct.
Where I was going was therefore they could be the same shitta. The Ran and Rashi could both hold in the case where there's no. In another case where there's a normal malacha, it's only the last bit. Happens to be these cases that have.
You're entirely correct, and this is where I want to go with it, that the gulf between Rashi and others may not be as big. But I want you to understand conceptually there's a profound difference between them. The point Asher just made is as follows. Maybe Rashi would also agree that it isn't Gemar Malach, it isn't Makkeh BePatish if there's another malacha involved. But the reason Rashi would say that svara is because there's another malacha involved. The reason the Meiri and the Aruch HaShulchan and the Shittul Ran said the svara is because finishing isn't manufacturing. Rashi doesn't go with that svara. I'm clear on that. Rashi does not hold that manufacturing can't be Makkeh BePatish by definition. It may be, Rashi holds, if it's another malacha, it's not Makkeh BePatish because there's a greater outcome. It's sort of bottle barov. If you ask the question, why is every baking of bread not Makkeh BePatish, you could give two answers to the question. One answer could be like the Meiri, because it's manufacturing, not completion. The other answer to the question may be Rashi's answer to the question, because it's another malacha. Afiyah is a type of Gemar malacha, but it's a more specific type of Gemar malacha. It's called afiyah. It subsumes Makkeh BePatish. Makkeh BePatish is only something which isn't another malacha, and therefore the whole significance of the achievement is that it is a finishing of something. But with afiyah, it's not a finishing of any old something, it's baking. And that's why it's a malacha of afiyah, not Makkeh BePatish. With ariga, it's not just the finishing of any old something, it's weaving. And that's why it's not Makkeh BePatish. So I've just given away the punchline for what will be our first year back. But you're entirely right, Asher. They are. There's an analogy between these two svaras, but they're not identical. We're running out of time, and I just want to give a third example of where we see this as Rashi's view, and then I'll take questions. The third example I want to give of this is we just think which example I'm going to give. Let's look at Rashi on Ein Daled Amud Beis. So Rashi on Ein Daled Amud Beis says in the Divrei Maschil Tanur, in the example of the manufacturing of the oven, Rashi is bothered why where it's, the Gemara there says, just to remind you, the Gemara is talking about manufacturing a tanur, and it says you're chayiv shmona, you're chayiv 8 melachos, and Rashi says that you're chayiv for Makkeh BePatish because he says after you bake it in the kiln, you smear it with another layer in order to make it thick and maintain the heat. And this is the Gemara melacha, and therefore it's Makkeh BePatish. That's the final Makkeh BePatish. And he says with chovis this isn't the case because when you bake it in the oven, it gets baked by itself, and therefore it's not Makkeh BePatish. We'll go into that far again. Now, if Makkeh BePatish is if Rashi would agree with the Meiri that Makkeh BePatish isn't manufacture but only finishing things off, why is Rashi bothered by this question that every time you bake chovis in a kiln, you should be chayiv for Makkeh BePatish? The answer is it's not Makkeh BePatish because that's the manufacture of the chovis. So again, it seems to me like this is Rashi Lushas also, who holds that manufacturing can also be Makkeh BePatish. So Rashi was open to the suggestion that baking a clay utensil in the kiln should be Makkeh BePatish, were it not for the fact that it's baking and therefore it happens me'elau, it happens by itself. But other than that, it would be Makkeh BePatish. So again, it seems that Rashi is consistent with his view, as are several other Rashis, that Gemara Melacha can simply also be the finishing of the manufacture. So I just hope that we're not, just to finish off, that we're not ending our final shiur before the break with complete confusion. We have a Me'iri and a Shulchan, each in their own way, who go along similar, though not identical lines, in which they say Makkeh BePatish has to be a discrete act of finishing, not the just manufacture of the object itself. And we have a Rashi who I'm arguing doesn't agree with that distinction, though we will need to analyze in the next shiur about how Makkeh BePatish relates to other melachos, and it may be Rashi agrees that if I'm doing another melacha, then it can't be this melacha, but that we'll have to look at with more care. In terms of Bein Ozmanim homework, if you have time over the holiday season, I would really urge you some to do chazara, really from Ayin Daled Amud Beis and on. We've seen so much over the last few months of learning. To do a chazara program, and especially when we're doing Makkeh BePatish, it's all intertwined. Also to finish off the Maramakomis, I gave out quite a heavy amount of source sheets, and to work through these Maramakomis, I would also suggest is worthwhile. And Emir Hashem, we will resume in whichever date in January, as we agreed on. What was that? The 9th of January, we'll Emir Hashem resume. So enjoy the break. Thank you so much, as always.
Sure.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.